Harper Moon's hands were still shaking when she found the photographs hidden in her husband's desk drawer. 23 pictures of women who looked exactly like her, each one crossed out in red ink with a single word scrawled beneath. Failed. The manila envelope had fallen behind the drawer when she was looking for stamps, and curiosity had gotten the better of her. Now, sitting in David's home office at 2 in the morning, Harper felt the familiar chill of recognition mixed with terror. These weren't random photographs. Each woman had her exact hair color, her bone structure, even the small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd gotten as a child. It was like looking at a collection of herself from different angles, different years, different lives she'd never lived. Harper's marriage to David had always felt too perfect, too orchestrated. They'd met at a coffee shop where she went every Tuesday morning for exactly 18 months. He'd approached her on a rainy Thursday, claiming he'd been watching her routine and found it charmingly predictable. At the time, she'd thought it was romantic. Now, the word predictable echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She spread the photographs across David's mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as she examined each face. Some of the women appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Others looked wrong. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. The photographs were dated, spanning back 15 years. The most recent was taken just 3 months ago, right around the time David had started suggesting they move to the isolated house in Millbrook, 2 hours from anyone who knew them. The sound of David's car in the driveway sent ice through Harper's veins. He wasn't supposed to be home until tomorrow from his business trip to Chicago. She frantically gathered the photographs, but her hands were shaking so badly that several scattered to the floor. The front door opened with its familiar creak, followed by David's voice calling her name in that honey-sweet tone that had once made her feel loved and now made her skin crawl. "Harper? Sweetheart, are you awake? I have a surprise for you." She managed to stuff most of the photographs back into the envelope, but 3 remained on the carpet. There was no time to retrieve them. Harper switched off the desk lamp and slipped out of the office through the connecting door to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floors. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, forcing herself to breathe normally, to act like the devoted wife David believed her to be. In the bathroom, Harper splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger someone who had been living a lie for 2 years without knowing it. Her green eyes, which David always complimented, now seemed like a trap. Her auburn hair, which he loved to run his fingers through, felt like a costume she couldn't remove. Everything about her that David claimed to adore was apparently just part of a pattern, a type he collected like butterflies pinned to a board. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and quickly got into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin and closing her eyes. The bedroom door opened quietly, and she felt David's presence before she heard him move. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching her pretend to sleep. She could smell his cologne, the expensive one she'd bought him for Christmas mixed with something else. Something metallic and sharp that made her stomach turn. "I know you're awake." "Harper." David's voice was different now, lacking its usual warmth. The office light was still warm when I touched it. Harper's eyes snapped open, and she found herself staring into David's face. In the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window, his features looked sharp and predatory. This wasn't the man who brought her coffee in bed every morning or who held her during thunderstorms. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had been wearing David's face like a mask. "We need to talk," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and Harper felt herself rolling slightly toward him against her will. "I think you found something that wasn't meant for you." Harper's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But David's hand was resting casually on her ankle through the blanket, his grip gentle but unmistakably firm. She realized with growing horror that this conversation had probably happened before with other women who looked just like her. Women who had discovered David's secret and then failed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. David smiled, and it was the same smile that had won her heart 2 years ago. But now she could see the coldness behind it, the calculation. Oh, Harper. Sweet, predictable Harper. "We both know that's not true." The next morning brought an eerie normalcy that made Harper question her own sanity. David hummed while making pancakes, kissed her forehead, and asked about her plans for the day as if their midnight conversation had been a fever dream. But Harper noticed things she'd been blind to before, the way he watched her reactions, the slight pause before his smiles, the methodical way he arranged everything in perfect order. "I was thinking we could drive to the lake today," David said, flipping a pancake with practiced precision. "Just the two of us. Like a second honeymoon." The lake was 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense woods where screams would never be heard. Harper forced herself to smile and nod, all while calculating distances and exit strategies. The photographs were gone from David's office. She'd checked when he went out to get the newspaper. Either he'd moved them, or she was losing her mind entirely. "That sounds lovely," she managed, accepting the plate he handed her. The pancakes were perfect golden circles, arranged just so. Everything David did was precise, controlled, deliberate. How had she ever mistaken that for caring? While David showered, Harper made a desperate call to her sister Jenny in Portland, using the landline in the kitchen and speaking in whispers. But when Jenny answered, her voice was strange, distant. "Harper? Oh, I was just thinking about you. David called me yesterday to let me know about your condition." Harper's blood turned to ice. "What condition?" "The paranoid episodes. He's so worried about you, sweetie. He said you've been having delusions, finding things that aren't there, imagining conspiracies. He thinks you might need professional help." The phone nearly slipped from Harper's numb fingers. David had been planning this conversation, laying groundwork to discredit anything she might say. If she told Jenny about the photographs now, It would only confirm David's story about her mental instability. "I have to go," Harper whispered, hanging up as she heard the shower shut off. David appeared in the kitchen doorway minutes later, hair damp and smiling that perfect smile. "Ready for our adventure?" The drive to the lake felt like a funeral procession. Harper sat in the passenger seat of David's pristine BMW, watching familiar landmarks disappear behind them as they drove deeper into isolated territory. David chatted about work, about how much he loved their life together, about plans for their future. But Harper caught him glancing at her in the rearview mirror, studying her reactions like a scientist observing a lab rat. Her phone had no signal by the time they reached the lake. David had chosen this spot carefully, just like everything else. The water stretched out before them, mirror-smooth and deceptively peaceful. David spread a blanket on the shore and unpacked a picnic basket with military precision. "Remember our first date?" he asked, opening a bottle of wine. "You said you felt like you'd been waiting your whole life for someone like me." Harper did remember. She'd been so lonely then, working long hours as a graphic designer and going home to an empty apartment every night. David had seemed like a miracle attentive, successful, devoted. Now she wondered how many other lonely women had said the same thing to him. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," Harper said carefully, watching his face for reactions. "About how perfectly everything fell into place, almost like it was planned." David's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. "The best things in life require planning, don't you think?" He poured wine into 2 glasses, the liquid dark as blood in the afternoon light. Harper accepted hers but didn't drink, noticing how David watched her lips, waiting. When she only pretended to sip, disappointment flickered across his features before the mask snapped back into place. "You know, Harper, I think we need to discuss last night more thoroughly," David said, setting down his untouched wine glass. "I think you saw something that upset you, and we should talk about it like adults." The reasonable tone was somehow more terrifying than any threat would have been. This was how he'd done it before, Harper realized. Reasonable conversations by beautiful lakes with women who looked just like her. Women who had trusted him right up until the moment they understood what he really was. "I didn't see anything," Harper said, but her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. David reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a manila envelope, the same one from his office. The photograph spilled across the blanket between them like tarot cards predicting her doom. Harper's face stared back at her 23 times, each image a different woman who had sat exactly where she was sitting now. Their names were Sarah, Michelle, Rebecca. Amanda ... double quotes. David recited the names like a prayer, touching each photograph tenderly. Each one was perfect in her own way. Each one was exactly what I was looking for. But they all had the same flaw, Harper. They all tried to leave me. Harper's muscles coiled for flight, but David's hand shot out and gripped her wrist with crushing force. His fingers found pressure points she didn't know existed, sending waves of paralyzing pain up her arm. "The thing is," David continued conversationally, I really thought you might be different. You've lasted longer than any of the others. 2 whole years of playing house, of being the perfect wife. I was starting to think maybe I'd finally found the one who wouldn't disappoint me." Harper tried to pull away, but David's grip tightened until she gasped. The photographs fluttered in the breeze, and she caught glimpses of the women's faces, her face, over and over again, but with different expressions: fear, pleading, and finally, nothing at all. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her throat. David leaned closer, and she could see her own reflection in his pupils, like she was already dead. "That's what they all said, Harper. Please," as if begging ever changed anything. Harper's survival instincts kicked in with crystalline clarity. She had maybe seconds before David's grip shifted from restraint to something final. Using the wine glass as a weapon, she smashed it against his temple, the sharp crack echoing across the water. David's grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free and bolt toward the tree line. Her bare feet found every sharp rock and broken twig as she crashed through the underbrush, but adrenaline numbed the pain. Behind her, David's voice remained calm and patient, like he was calling a beloved pet who had wandered off. "Harper, you're only making this harder on yourself. There's nowhere to go out here. I chose this place very carefully." She knew he was right. They were miles from civilization, and David knew these woods. But Harper had one advantage he hadn't counted on. She'd been a cross-country runner in college, and muscle memory was flooding back with every desperate stride. Her lungs found their rhythm even as branches tore at her clothes and thorns opened cuts on her arms. The sound of David crashing through the trees behind her grew fainter, and Harper allowed herself a moment of hope. She'd always been faster than him during their morning jogs together, though she'd pretended otherwise to protect his ego. Another small deception in a marriage built on lies, but this one might save her life. Harper's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her so badly she nearly tripped. One bar of signal had somehow found her in the wilderness. With shaking fingers, she dialed 911, but the call dropped immediately. She tried again as she ran, this time managing to gasp out her location before the connection died again. She'd been running for nearly an hour when she spotted the old hunting cabin through the trees. The structure was clearly abandoned, half the roof caved in and windows broken, but it offered shelter and a chance to catch her breath. Harper squeezed through a gap in the boarded-up door and found herself in what had once been a living room, now home to mice and decay. In the dim light filtering through broken boards, Harper discovered she wasn't the first person to take refuge here. Scratched into the wooden walls were names, dates, and desperate messages. "Sarah Collins, if you find this. Tell my mother I love her. Michelle Torres. He's been planning this for years. Rebecca Jung, the photographs are real." Harper's legs gave out as the full scope of David's crimes hit her. These weren't just names from his collection. These were real women who had run just like she was running, who had hidden in this same cabin, who had carved their final words into these walls. Her hands traced the letters, feeling the desperation in every gouge. At the bottom of one wall, almost hidden by debris, she found fresher scratches, Amanda Foster, there's a gun hidden under the floorboard by the fireplace. Harper's heart hammered as she clawed at the rotting floorboards Amanda had indicated. Her fingers found metal, and she pulled out a small revolver wrapped in plastic. Amanda Foster, whoever she was, had managed to hide a weapon here before whatever had happened to her. The gun was old but functional, and Harper found 3 bullets in the chamber. Outside, David's voice grew closer. "Harper, I'm disappointed in you. Running away like this is so predictable. I thought you were more creative than the others, but you're following their exact playbook." Harper crouched behind the collapsed section of roof, gun raised in trembling hands. Through a gap in the boards, she could see David approaching the cabin with methodical precision. He wasn't even breathing hard, and that casual confidence was more terrifying than any rage would have been. "I know you're in there, sweetheart. This is where they always go." Poor Amanda lasted 3 days in there before hunger drove her out. David's laugh was soft and fond, like he was sharing a cherished memory. "She was so brave, just like you. That's what I love about you girls. You never give up hope, even when you should." Harper's finger found the trigger as David's shadow filled the doorway. This was it, kill or be killed, just like in the photographs of all those other women who had faced this same moment. But as David stepped into the cabin, Harper saw something that made her blood freeze. He was holding a larger gun, a hunting rifle that made her small revolver look like a toy. And he was smiling that same loving smile he'd worn when he proposed to her in their perfect little restaurant with its perfect little corner table that he'd probably used to propose to other women who looked just like her. "There's my girl," David said softly, as if they were still playing house instead of hunting each other in the wilderness. "I have to admit, you've given me the best chase yet. I'm actually going to miss you more than the others." Harper's hands were shaking so badly she could barely aim, but she forced herself to remain steady. She thought of Sarah, Michelle, Rebecca, Amanda, and all the unnamed women whose lives had ended in moments like this. She thought of the wives who would come after her if David walked away from this cabin. "The difference between you and me, David," Harper said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, "is that you think this is a game you've already won." David's smile faltered slightly. In all his careful planning, he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd never considered what would happen if one of his victims stopped running and decided to fight back instead. Harper pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest like thunder, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Harper wasn't sure who had pulled their trigger first. Then David stumbled backward, his rifle clattering to the cabin floor as he clutched his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, but his eyes remained locked on Harper with an expression of profound surprise. "You actually did it," he breathed, and for the first time since she'd known him, David sounded genuinely impressed. None of the others ever. Harper kept the gun trained on him, her hands no longer shaking. Something had shifted inside her when she'd pulled that trigger, a fundamental change that she could feel in her bones. She wasn't the same terrified woman who had discovered those photographs just 24 hours ago. That woman had died in the moment she chose to fight back. None of the others had a reason to live, Harper said quietly. I do. David slumped against the cabin wall, his perfect composure finally cracking. You don't understand what you've done. This isn't over. There are others who know about my work, who appreciate what I've been trying to accomplish. They'll come looking for me. Let them come. Harper picked up his rifle and backed toward the door, keeping both weapons pointed at him. I'll be ready. As she stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, Harper heard the distant sound of sirens. Her 911 call had gotten through after all, and help was finally coming. But she knew this wasn't really an ending, it was a beginning. David's words about others who knew about his work echoed in her mind. How many more men like him were out there? How many more women were living in marriages built on lies and manipulation? The first police car arrived 30 minutes later, followed by an ambulance and a parade of investigators who would spend the next several hours documenting the crime scene. Harper sat on a fallen log and watched the controlled chaos. David's blood still on her hands and Amanda Foster's gun resting in her lap like a talisman. Detective Sarah Martinez was the first to approach her, and Harper was struck by the irony of the name. Another Sarah, but this one was alive and strong and asking the right questions. Mrs. Moon, can you tell me what happened here today? Harper looked past the detective toward the cabin where David was being loaded onto a stretcher. He was conscious and talking, probably already spinning some version of events that would paint her as the unstable wife he'd warned everyone about. But Harper had the photographs now, and she had the names carved into the cabin walls, and she had her own testimony. I found out my husband has been killing women who look like me for 15 years, Harper said simply. And I decided I wasn't going to be next. The investigation that followed would uncover the full scope of David's crimes. 23 women across 6 states, all sharing Harper's physical characteristics, all disappearing after brief marriages to charming men who were all David using different names. The photographs were just the beginning. Investigators found journals, recordings, and detailed plans for each murder. David had been methodical in his documentation, never imagining that his own careful records would become the evidence that convicted him. But Harper's story didn't end with David's arrest. In the weeks that followed, she received letters from families of his victims, women who had been searching for answers about daughters and sisters who had simply vanished. She started a foundation in Amanda Foster's name, helping other women recognize the warning signs of predatory relationships and providing resources for those trying to escape. The media called her a hero, but Harper knew better. She was simply a woman who had refused to become a victim when the moment of choice arrived. The scared, isolated person David had tried to make her had died in that cabin along with his hold over her. 6 months later, Harper stood in a courtroom and watched a judge sentence David Moon to life in prison without parole. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by orange prison clothes and shackles. When he turned to look at her one final time, Harper saw no trace of the charming man who had swept her off her feet. There was only a hollow shell of someone who had built his entire identity around the control and destruction of others. Do you have anything to say to the defendant? The judge asked Harper. Harper stood and looked directly at David, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. You told me I was predictable. You were wrong. You predicted I would die like all the others. Instead, I chose to live. As Harper walked out of that courtroom into the bright afternoon sun, she felt truly free for the first time in years. David's shadow no longer fell across her path, and the future stretched ahead of her like an open road. She had work to do, women to help, and a life to live on her own terms. The woman who had discovered those photographs in a desk drawer was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had looked evil in the face and refused to blink. Harper Moon had found herself in the darkest moment of her life, and she had chosen to survive. Ready to hear more stories of survival and transformation? Subscribe now for more psychological thrillers that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about finding strength in impossible situations, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Harper's situation? Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories of human resilience. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads.